Hello, this presentation is called Four Horsemen Cometh, an Apocalyptic Furnace. It's a subtitle, The Origins of Modern Patriarchy, Capitalism and Imperialism in 16th, 17th century Europe. The background is Bruegel's Triumph of Death, famous painting from the end of the 15th, start of the 16th centuries. For this presentation, I will be attempting to fuse three books together. The basic understandings that they have of this era, and the actual themes which link all three of these books is to do with the primacy of struggle, and that social relations are the most important uh, definitions to work by in analyzing and categorizing societies as they move through history. So the first one is by Ellen Meiksins Wood, or there on the left. This is called The Origin of Capitalism, and it's based mainly around France and England, the differences and similarities between the two in 16th, 17th century Europe. This is when the start of capitalism begins and the end, and feudalism goes into serious decline. And so Ellen Meiksins Wood is mainly focused on this area, but as I say, all three of these authors have the same thematic approach to dealing with history. The second one is called Caliban and the Witch, and it's the subtitle there, as you can see, is Woman, the Body and Primitive Accumulation. And this is by Silvia Federici. She's an American Italian author, and her focus is wider than Ellen Meiksins Wood. She takes in quite a bit of what's going on in other countries in Western Europe, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, especially, and Germany, as well as the countries we've already mentioned. And her focus is mainly on to do with women and the role and status of women, and in this period, and also the 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 symbol of Caliban. Caliban is a character out of one of Shakespeare's plays, The Tempest, and Caliban here is used to symbolize the other, meaning whether the other is peasants who've been kicked off the land, or whether it's indigenous peoples, Africans who've been enslaved, this sort of thing, indigenous peoples in the Americas. So that's the second one, and then the third one is called The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism. Now, this is by Professor Gerald Horne. It specifically focuses on the 17th century, but there is now a prequel which starts in the 16th, which is to do with the 16th century. So these are actually now two books. And the roots of it's subtitled The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy and Capitalism in 17th Century North American and the Caribbean. So you can see that the focus here is primarily on North America and the Caribbean, but it deals with exactly the same period. I think the prequel deals with more, obviously because of Spain, Portugal's role, it deals with Central and and South America as well. But it's the Americas basically. But as I say, all three of these books have the same theme, so I'm trying to combine them, all three of them, into the one analysis, which I shall now proceed to do. So we start with the imagery of the apocalypse and the triumph of death that was a common cultural theme in Europe as the 15th century came to an end. We can see over there on the right, we can see our Dürer's famous Four Horsemen engraving. I think it's an engraving or woodcut. You can see that on the right, and you've got the four horsemen of the apocalypse from the Bible depicted there. Feudalism in this was in the start of this period. Feudalism had failed. The hegemony of old elites was crumbling, and it seemed the very fabric of Christendom was about to rend in two. This is internally through rising doctrinal challenges, and externally as well, brought home by the enormous shock that was felt by all at the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. What do such obsessions reveal about contemporary European society over such a tumultuous period? To understand this, we need to dissect the anatomy of feudal Europe, what made it unique, and how and why such a crisis unfolded. Prior to European feudalism, for a few thousand years across the world, exploitative states and the class conflicts they engendered had arisen and fallen. Yet the pursuit of a surplus, that is, a surplus derived from exploiting labor, had always at last reached its limit and then collapsed as extraction of the necessary labor power and taxation to support the means of repression and extraction, and of also plundering enemies. This is an important point, especially in early pre-capitalist societies, was restrained in all cases by successful class struggle waged by the social base. Feudal Europe was characterized by a triple separation in society between those who fought, those who prayed, and those who worked. You can see this opposite, this very good illustration there of what's going on. You have the knight in the middle, in full armor with his shield and helmet, and he's in conversation with the priest or the monk on his left, and looking askance at both of them on the right is the third component, the people who work, who are basically looking on askance at these two having a great time. So, except in England, the monarchs were relatively weak, and localized vassals typically exercised political autonomy from the crown. The only real unity in the system was mediated not by the kings or the royal families, but by the Church of Rome, because the Church of Rome was universal. This also provided the ideology for keeping everyone in their place. with the many potential instabilities, such as the threat posed by landless noble younger sons, which we will be coming back to, being displaced to the boundaries of Christendom in the Crusades. The holding of land by such a diverse patchwork of nobles and clergy was essential to the system, and all was held together through complex ties of fealty. The peasantry were by and large tied to the land and owed the lord their labour and service in a multitude of forms. The rights of the landowner versus those of the peasants set the scene for the daily class struggle in the fields. From the ruling class's point of view, therefore, the efficient extraction of labour was being constantly tested and challenged under feudalism, often by the serf playing off religious duties against those owed to the noble. The most obvious example of this was to do with holy days. There were lots of holy days in every year, and the peasants would often claim that they had to observe a holy day, meaning they did nothing, rather than go out and work in the fields of the Lord. Wage labor was increasingly required to boost this surplus, but such a recourse was even more unpopular and only possible due to the large increase in the rural population of the 12th to 13th centuries. This meant that the peasants' plots of land required for their own subsistence were growing smaller. So wage work was often necessary to support their families. It was decidedly unpopular, and we will be coming back to this later on. In this period too, however, towns were growing through increased trade, so runaway serfs could get their freedom there by seeking royal protection. Because the royal, one of the few things that the crown did actually control directly was, in general, not entirely, was the towns and cities. We have to realize that that 12th to 13th century Europe was in many ways already a cash-based economy and was becoming increasingly urbanized, high population. Cash was required in a whole lot of different situations by this period, and yet the feudal relations had not yet changed. So just because you've got towns and money floating about doesn't necessarily mean that you move straight to capitalism. You can see an illustration of this to the bottom, with the peasants working in the fields. The central problem of the nobility's landless younger sons was never solved under feudal social relations, however. And when the escape valve of the Crusades died out, such unemployed young men now sought other, more destabilizing means to indulge their violent careers, this time closer to feudalism's core. They could no longer go to the Holy Land and cause mayhem there, so they started causing mayhem closer to home. It often meant as well hiring out as mercenaries young landless knights and so on and so forth. And this was starting to destabilize the system which had been set up originally under Charlemagne. Ambitious kings increasingly needed vast reserves of gold and silver as well to pay for armies that had been previously raised through feudal service. So we can see that the elements there of a change were there, but there isn't the motor yet to take it to something else. It could just collapse. As the 13th century ended and the 14th century began, feudalism as a system of labor exploitation suffered two shocks that were to finish it off, in essence. These were the start of climate change. This is the so-called start of the mini ice age. And this negatively affected crop production and caused famines. And this was followed in short order by a catastrophic epidemic that may have carried off up to 50% of Europe's population, i.e. the Black Death. This catastrophic epidemic was probably made more catastrophic by the fact that the famines and the general lack of peasant resilience to the plague carrying them off meant that the casualty rate was much higher. However, the aftermath enabled the peasants to take advantage of the shortage of labor so that they could demand higher wages, and simultaneously they took advantage of this as well to end many of the most onerous feudal dues and obligations that they owed to both lords and the clergy. It also meant that larger numbers of women were by now inheriting land and running businesses. This was challenging the traditional Christian patriarchy, which had been set up again in the start of the Middle Ages. Essentially, the first round in this new class war therefore went to those at the bottom of the hierarchy, not to those at the top. Peasant land holdings increased, wages went up as work hours decreased, and the enriched changes to diet and clothing, this is general clothing, not noble clothing, from the late 14th century reflect the new average affluence of ordinary people. You can see contemporary illustration there on the right. I think it's from the early 16th century with peasants having great time and having a big party with music and dance and so on and so forth. So the feudal elites, had this continued, the feudal elites might have simply dwindled away in the same kind of reassertion of the base, interregnum, that had ended so many other systems of exploitation before it. We can think of many examples. We can see the various dynasties of China, the Roman Empire collapsing, all these sorts of examples. Had it not been for two other random events that gave these elites the opportunity to reconfigure the relations of production in their own favor. Now, the first of these was the so-called discovery of the Americas, using new innovations in sailing ship technology, originally developed by the Portuguese. And the second being the concept of improving the land, arising out of ideological, that is Protestant, challenge to the old dominance of the Catholic Church as feudalism waned. This all took place slowly over the later 15th and early 16th centuries. and is connected to the completion of the Spanish Reconquista in 1492, and also the start of the Italian wars between France and Austria, or the Habsburg family, should I say, which included Spain in 1494. On the left, we can see some illustrations there of the conquest of the Americas, and some quite graphic ones, especially at the bottom, that shows the reality of all this. We have already stated the problem of fiercely competitive landless nobles under feudalism originally, and their capacity for violence to gain riches and land, how it now propelled the fury, sheer savagery, and plundering unleashed on the newly explored continent, primarily by Portugal and Spain. In this case. Later, the news pricked up ears in the royal court of Spain when it was discovered how much gold and silver was to be had there, essential for paying the mercenary armies of the Habsburg monarchs in their wars with France for European hegemony. More decisive by far than the firepower, armor, or horses of these relatively few European invaders, I would argue, was a cruel trick of fate, namely the bacteria they had inadvertently brought with them in the form of smallpox and measles. This was to do with the close habitation of Europeans and their animals, which you didn't get in the Americas. And the diseases which had been transferred from the animals to humans, and the humans had built up some sort of resistance to it in Europe, but not in the Americas. So this disaster carried off, it is estimated, up to 95% of the native people encountered. And this was catastrophic. Probably much more catastrophic than any of the atrocities or the military conquests that were being inflicted on them simultaneously. They could probably have kicked them out in short order, even if they only had slings against muskets, because the Europeans were so few in number at this point. Although the proper realization of capitalism was yet to emerge, we are best to understand this terrible atrocities and the tragedy as being the world's first manifestation of the so-called primitive accumulation of capital. The latter was defined by Marx as the early form of capitalism where wage contracts do not yet dominate, and other cruder or more primitive forms of exploitation, such as slavery, are utilized to raise the capital required for investment in manufacture. It is also tied to the initial expropriation of livelihoods, land, and resources, and turning them into private property. And this is obviously applicable to the phenomenon of settler colonialism. It is the opinion today of many historians that primitive accumulation did not just happen once in the English case used by Marx, but in fact is a recurring feature of capitalism. Carries on right to this present day, ad nauseam, reapplied to cope with the perpetual crises that the system of capitalism engenders. In the Americas, the colonizers wasted no time in trying to enslave the indigenes to mine more gold and silver. Not, however, to invest in manufacture, as Marx defined, but to spend on war, as late period feudal or absolutist monarchies were dominating across Iberia, which were the pioneers, if you like, of the settler colonial projects that were to develop. It should also be pointed out that many of the slaves either died or ran away to places where the Europeans couldn't get hold of them. So it wasn't a very efficient process, and it also didn't last. So in 100 years, this supply of gold and silver was exhausted. One byproduct, however, of later critical significance from this initial gold rush was the world's first financial banks. We'll be coming to that later. You can see an illustration of the sort of exploitation of indigenous and probably Black people there at the bottom in working these mines. Back in Europe, and with so much new minted or melted down coinage in their pockets, the rulers, who had been somewhat reduced in their capabilities previously, were starting to muster the forces of repression that they would need in order to reassert power over peasants and women. These were the people who had temporarily broken with the ordinary people at the bottom of the pyramid, who had broken away and managed to reassert dominance. So revenge was on the cards. The first moves were to turn the peasantry into tenants who paid rent rather than being forced to perform services. Increasingly, increasing rent was a more effective means of forcing the peasant to work harder for his lord, and there was always the threat of eviction hanging over a household as peasants fell into debt. Sharecropping or cottage industries became common as means to pay these increasing demands were required. Such moves, however, especially after their brief enjoyment of freedom and affluence, were resisted fiercely, most spectacularly in the German Peasants' War of 1525. You can see that illustrated in a contemporary picture there on the left. The word on the banner is in German. It says Freiheit, which means freedom, and this is to depict the peasants fighting against the nobles. On the continent, the rival absolutist monarchs waged war upon war while their stocks of gold and silver lasted. But by the end of the futile / catastrophic 30 Years' War in 1648, all the battling powers of Europe were exhausted, or all those who had participated. We will be coming to one that didn't really participate soon. Worse by far was the fate of the peasantry, as fugitives / displaced peasants returned to find not only high rents and lower wages, but also in many cases expropriation of their commonly held lands. These are the pastures and so on, and the lands which they were entitled to grow their own subsistence and to keep themselves going, no matter what they were earning in wages and so on. And this was now starting to expropriate them. While the wars of religion and acts of cruelty by the Inquisition, etc., were horrendous enough, what is much overlooked is the phenomenon of the witch trials that took place roughly between 1480 and 1695-99 period. The exact scale of these barbarities, particular barbarities, is still under-researched. But it was certainly extensive. I think Federici claims about 100,000 at least, and it may have been much higher than this. And a phenomenon as well that afflicted both Protestant and Catholic spheres in equal measure. What is revealing is that women were almost exclusively targeted, and that the polities that burned or hanged these so-called witches, usually after torture, were the same ones where early attempts at peasant expropriation and making the latter into exclusive wage earners were also being tried out. And often these processes were going on simultaneously. On the right there, we can see a contemporary illustration of a witch trial, the end of the witch trials with, or a witch trial with a number of women being publicly hanged as an example. Certainly by 1700, women had been completely closeted as chattels in the domestic economy, and their former centrality to life, landowning, and economic significance, as feudalism ended, was curtailed. It is undeniable that in this period, the status of women was degraded significantly. And the theologies of both religious sects at the time were obsessively focused on demonizing women and turning them into chattels. That's what the witchcraft accusations were all about. This, in fact, can be seen as a precursor to women's role in an economy now being built exclusively on male wage labor, where the female role is as an unpaid housekeeper and reproductive worker for the idealized, atomized laborer. The witch trials, therefore, served as a means to deliver the terror and trauma required on women as a whole to deliver this change in a time of profound and unsettling social transformation to a new social order and a much heightened mode of labor exploitation. It is also of note that in the various revolts, rebellions, and even revolutions against this new order, that women often played a big role, taking part in and starting them off. This is natural, as after all, women had the most to lose. And perhaps the victors' ideologues decided that it was women in particular who needed to be taught a lesson. Finally, men stood to, if you like to call it this, gain out of the new arrangement. For even if a man was forced to sell his labor in the marketplace to survive, well, then at least he had his own slave. Oh, just one thing I should say about that. The picture on the left, as we saw it, this one here, this was a typical punishment, not to do with which the craft as such. It was a punishment for scolding, so-called scolding women, where they put a cage on top of their wife's head, tie a rope around her neck, and then there was also a device which kept her mouth shut as well, which you can see in that picture. Another consequence of the social upheavals, religious persecution, constant war, expropriation, and enclosure over these 200 years was a huge increase in the number of so-called vagrants, forced to beg or seek, and that's beg in the towns mainly, but also in the countryside, or seek shelter in the forests at the fringes of settled society. The aversion to contract wage labor was so strong amongst peasantry that they preferred such a precarious lifestyle, because at least by that way, even if they didn't have a home as such, at least they were free to a certain degree. And they had a measure of control over their own lives. We can see some vagrants there on the right in the contemporary illustration, moving around and doing various odd jobs and playing instruments and begging and so on and so forth. This is how they generally survive, but they also might engage in banditry, which of course the nobles didn't like. So it was seen, the phenomenon of vagrancy was seen as a threat to the new ruling class that was increasingly being based on the absolute ownership of private property. And being a homeless person was criminalized with humiliating punishments, such as branding, whipping, and mass executions. You can see this going on below. You can see somebody who has already been hanged outside the town gates, and this beggar is being dragged through the streets, being whipped as he goes, presumably for the same end. And they also put branding on your head. This was a favorite pastime in England by the so-called justices. After the initial round of state terrorism described, vagrants were to be increasingly sentenced to indentured labor. This was a form of slavery in the American colonies. It was a temporary form of slavery, but it was still a form of slavery, in that you had a period, or it was usually about 7 years, I think, and or it could be higher, but it was often 7 years where you were a slave. And and you were transported to the American colonies to do this slavery, and primarily to work on the new commodity production plantations that were being set up there. Here too, the indentured laborers often escaped into the towns where they could live free, or they fled into the wilderness. And we know many cases where they preferred to be adopted into Indian societies, who are happy to adopt them. In fact, many were, to the cruelties of early capitalism. So if they preferred that, then that says a lot about what was going on in the process of enforcing early capitalism. The colonies were, however, also proving to be the stage for devising a new and much more suitable means of recreating the other. Now, all exploitative systems across the world and across time since about 5,000 to 10,000 years ago, that is, not to the humans have been around for 100,000 years on the planet, but exploitative systems have only been around for between 5,000 to 10,000 of these. And there's always the other is required. And the old means, as under feudalism, of dividing humanity up was primarily by religious differences, but this was starting to subside. It could be recreated in certain circumstances, but the main one was to do with whether you were Christian or whether you were Jewish in particular. They were extremely persecuted against, and or Muslim. And then, of course, there was another period where it was like whether you were Catholic or Protestant. But this was starting to subside by the 17th century. So there had to be a new form of other. And the important concept that was coming up was this new concept of race, hitherto of minimal importance, not entirely absent, but of minimal importance, and given enthusiastic impetus by the discovery of how enslaved Africans could be cheaply transported across the Atlantic. That is much cheaper than bringing indentured laborers across from Europe. Packed into the holds of ships, as we know about, being not only more immune to tropical diseases than indentured Europeans, but also easily identifiable if they managed to run away. So thus rose the nebulous idea of whiteness, and whiteness is a very nebulous idea. It can move backwards and forwards, and people who were once seen as being colored might be seen as being white the next minute, and so on and so forth. And in particular, if one looks at the designation of what Jews were, this in this crazy system of your skin color, you can understand what was going on. So this was the first notions of settler colonialism moving out of feudalism into a capitalist context. Separation was achieved by turning the poor European into the potential overseer over the black or colored, and by making the African slave in particular into a permanent racial category that was transmissible over succeeding generations. This is all written down in law, and the poor person who was subject to this was denied all rights by legal means. You can see there on the right a illustration of the start of this process in the 17th century, though it actually started in the 16th, but this is a 17th century example of it, someone who's been brought over from Africa as an object, basically, to be to be bought and sold as a chattel slave in the colonies. We're going to divert slightly here to look at culture, because I think it's an important illustration that I've chosen. Shakespeare's plays from the late 16th to early 17th centuries, such as Othello, The Merchant of Venice, and The Tempest, serve as remarkable allegories in the way that they illustrate the changes in perception of the other and how they frame the development of racialized ideas within European consciousness. Moving away from religion, the Merchant of Venice is predominantly to do with religion, but also involves racial stereotypes there as well. Othello, of course, is partly to do with race, and the Tempest, as I will describe in a minute. In The Tempest, for example, the European survivors of a shipwreck are washed up on an island inhabited by two forces in struggle against each other. If this is an analogy to the so-called New World, the monstrous and inherently violent Caliban, is he an Afro-Indigene? It seems to indicate from the subtext that exactly what he is. Initially recruits the former against his entrepreneurial and wise, allegedly, but flawed, of course, slave master Prospero. Although Caliban is, so he's like a rebel slave. We can see the image there. That's from a recent production with two of the shipwrecked Europeans meeting Caliban for the first time. I think they had a African origin actor playing the or at least black actor anyway, playing Caliban, which is quite illustrative. So although Caliban is presented as being wronged, he is still subhuman and a force of irrational evil, according, this is the subtext in Shakespeare's play, unfortunately. The story is only resolved when the marooned Europeans eventually realize their mistake and decide to make common cause with Prospero, defeating Caliban and thereby enabling a happy resolution for themselves, obviously not for Caliban. It's easy to see how the bard was, in his day, he was wrestling with the context, all these ideas that were floating around when he met his friends, all these things would have been discussed, are not obviously in the terms that we're using, but the whole idea of these whole new forms of otherizing people, like racism were coming in. Religious ones were still there, but they were on their way out, and or at least temporarily out, because they can always be brought back at a later stage. So forming around him were these concepts of racism and settler colonialism in their genesis, and he, I believe, was seeking to, on one hand, to justify it to his contemporaries, because that was the circles he was moving in. He was moving in the circles of the elites, the merchants and the princes and the nobles and the traders and the plantation owners. But on the other hand, he was also giving empathic voice to those who had not yet been fully othered into pure objects. So this is the contradiction, fundamental contradictions that exist in Shakespeare's work. So we can't completely dismiss them because they do acknowledge the contradiction, but on the other hand, they do illustrate the contradiction very strongly. So again, it is feasible that our modern world that's governed by capitalist values could have collapsed, or at least disintegrated under the force of its own contradictions. This is again, we've already dealt with it, possibly collapsing in the start of the 14th century or the middle of the 14th century, but it could possibly have taken place around about the middle of the 17th century. As the continental powers exhausted their initial acquisitions on the battlefields of Europe and went into absolutist stagnation, absolutism being very late form of feudalism, where everything's focused on the absolute monarch. Had it not been for the luck of one small power, originally on the periphery of this first great drive to primitive accumulation, this being the capital, this being the Kingdom of England, a latecomer to the settler colonial plunder over the Americas project, but with some unique advantages in enforcing the new social relations at home, and destined to produce most of the ideologists that drove these forward into the future with Enlightenment rationalism as unassailable truths. Feudal England had been highly centralized since the Norman conquest in 1066, with less room for maneuver by the great lords. Taxation and justice were mainly controlled by royal officers, while farmers were to a degree already tenants. Even though the Normans had temporarily at least turned them into serfs, the bonds of villeinage, that is serfdom, were broken asunder quite spectacularly in the 14th century, took place in the Peasants' Revolt. The estates of the high nobles were also much bigger than in France. So there was much less scope to extract dues via direct feudal coercion, because you've got a huge estate, but there's only you and a few of your henchmen to administer it and make sure that the peasants are supplying their surplus. So you've got to find other ways of getting that surplus to you. In the picture above, we can see the enclosure that took place roughly between 1485 and 1607 through various acts of parliament, and also through actions carried out independently by lords. And we can see that the center of England, the Midlands, is particularly affected. Also, the north of East Anglia, that's basically Norfolk, was very heavily enclosed. And we can also see a few other outcrops. Now, by the end of the 17th century, a lot of these outcrops would have grown to be about the same size as the densely enclosed areas in the center. Now, what enclosure really meant was that the common lands were enclosed. So that meant that if the peasants were able to and wanted to stay in the land, as we've noted, a lot of them became vagrants. But if they were determined to stay on the land, then they would have to basically sell their labor under wage contracts, and the wages could be reduced quite considerably. And in fact, where during this period we see a complete drop in living standards across the 16th, 17th century amongst the poor. Thomas More was Chancellor for King Henry VIII of England. For a brief period, he was later executed, but he summed up the replacement of Norfolk people that was going on, this commercial need to get rid of people by replacing them with sheep, so that the wool could be sold to the industries that were developing in the Netherlands, under these so-called profitable land improvements. So the actual quotation is worth reading out, because it is a very good allegory of what was going on. Now, Thomas More himself was involved in this process, so he was sort of conflicted about it, much in the same way as Shakespeare was probably conflicted about his the way he was feeling inside about all what was going on in his time. The same way Thomas More definitely was, because he took it down in his writing, where he made this this allegory, which you can see on the right. Your sheep that were wont to be so meek and tame, and so small eaters, now, as I hear say, be become so great devourers and so wild that they eat up and swallow down the very men themselves. Now, obviously, this isn't literal, but it's a figure of speech. It's a metaphor. Right, central to the rising English ideology were thinkers like John Locke, who you can see on the right. He was originally an accountant for Cromwell during his conquest of Ireland, that is, settler colonial conquest of Ireland, and who, in his theorizing prose, he was started to do this once he was pensioned off, as it were. This is him probably in the 1660s, 1670s. Sharpened the concepts of improving the land, this concept which keeps coming back, improving the land by getting rid of the people, basically. Enclosing the commons for the owner's profit, and establishing the absolute rights of private property over people. Via its agrarian revolution, early transition to tenant relations, and centralized state that was capable of changing the laws through a king and parliament, thereby negating the need for surplus extraction through direct coercion stroke consent, as you would see in France predominantly, England emerged as the perfect vehicle for capitalism to come into its full fruition only by sheer chance of history. In England, the transition to capitalist social relations was most complete and destructive to the rights of the peasantry. We've already seen that this process was also going on in Europe, but it was less destructive immediately. It was being resisted even still during the 17th century, whereas by the late 17th century, the victory of the bourgeoisie is almost complete. The kingdom was able to pirate and piggyback off the declining Iberian so-called achievements in the Americas, namely their conquests, and exploit its originally marginal North American colonies. That's the ones that England had acquired in New England and so forth, by making and then eventually expanding down into the southern part where it was able to make full use of its now near total dominance over the West African slave trade, and this eclipsed the Caribbean, in fact, as the southern states of what was to become the United States, but was still under the Crown of England. This is where they were able to put the primitive accumulation of capital through slavery of Africans into full use. The faltering European banks, which we talked about, they were now faltering because they'd run out of money, basically. And they were easily eclipsed by the Bank of England in 1694. With the end of the royal monopoly over the slave trade in the 1699 so-called glorious revolution, that was its main purpose, was to open up the royal monopoly of the slave trade to private entrepreneurs, so-called free trade. And this became the vehicle for the future investment in manufacture, namely Blake's dark satanic mills that he would later talk about, or so-called free trade. And this would later be used against India and China much later on, over the next century, in fact. So this was starting this process, rather than being wasted on inter-European wars, which the absolute monarchs had done. So there's a picture of John Locke there on the right in his later years. So thus it was at the end of the 17th century, capitalist England emerged unexpectedly as a global imperial power without equal. And it was very unexpected, only to be succeeded at last by, this is many centuries onwards, by a rebel successor state on the other side of the Atlantic, namely the US Empire. This was a successor which had fully absorbed all the ideology and all the practices of implementing capitalism from its parent. By fusing the themes and study areas together of these three seminal and related histories I've outlined at the start, I am trying to show the interconnectedness of this crucial event in world history and display how it constrains and imprisons us still in the present. We can explore each theme separately and in a lot more detail in future presentations. We have over there on the left, we have an image. This is from much later on. This is the concluding image. It shows the capitalist pyramid as it was seen at the end of the 19th start of the 20th centuries. And it's actually, this is a version from the that was created by the Industrial Workers of the World as one of their illustrations. And you can see the big bag of money right at the top of the pyramid. And then you have the rulers, and then you have the priests or the ideologues, the media, disseminators, whatever you want to call them. We fool you, capitalism, we rule you, we fool you, and then we shoot at you. This is, so if you get out of order, then we have the police and the army and so on and so forth there, who are there to keep you in place. And then under that, we have the prosperous classes who are all sitting, eating the food that and drinking the wine and so forth that has been made by the base. The base is the workers and peasants, people who work for all and feeding all, and we can see them being crushed by the weight of this enormous pyramid. So this is an illustration. It's not really related to the period that we're dealing with, but it serves as a very good illustration of what the capitalist system is all about. So I hope I've shown adequately that it was a matter of accident, not destiny, that this unique system imposed itself on us in the way that it did. Capitalism, together with its ancillary evils of racism and patriarchy, were not ordained by either God or science. And so therefore, we're able to collectively seize the initiative and force it to disappear in the same short order that it appeared. That is, assuming how we can learn from and take inspiration from the brave struggles of our ancestors against it. Thank you, everybody. This is the end of the presentation.